Some men lift a glass because they have something to celebrate. That night, I lifted mine because I needed both hands occupied while I memorized every word being said about my daughter in a language everyone at the table assumed I couldn't understand. Keep smiling, Mark. That was the instruction I kept giving myself. Smile. Pour the wine. Don't react. We were sitting at a restaurant outside Leesburg, the kind of place people booked weeks ahead because the dining room opened onto Virginia horse country. Past the windows were long green fields, white fences, old trees, and expensive horses moving slowly beneath a fading sunset. It was the sort of view that made a place feel established, comfortable, respectable. I had chosen it on purpose. Julian's parents had flown in from France, and I wanted them to feel welcomed. More importantly, I wanted Molly to look around that table and see the two sides of her future family getting along. That was all I wanted. A peaceful dinner, a happy daughter, maybe even the beginning of something good. Instead, I got a warning, and strangely enough, it began with a bottle of wine. Jean-Luc turned the bottle slowly in his hand, reading the label as if he were examining evidence at a trial. "Mark, this is the wine you chose." His French accent had a way of making ordinary questions sound like accusations. "That's the one." He studied the label again. "In France, we would never pair this with duck." "It's from Virginia," I told him. "Small vineyard west of here." He gave the bottle one last look before putting it down. A pause. Local. The word somehow managed to sound like a diagnosis. Across from him, Beatrice smiled. Not warmly. It was the smile an adult gives a child who has proudly brought home something made from glue and construction paper. "And what exactly is your work again, Mark?" "I'm a contractor." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Construction?" She pronounced the word as though I'd just told her I cleaned septic tanks. "I build houses." I took a sip of water. "Mostly custom homes these days." "How practical." Then she returned to her wine. "Practical. There are words people use because they mean one thing, and words people use because they want you to hear another. That was the second kind." I let it pass. Molly was sitting beside Julian, laughing at something he'd whispered to her. Her hand was resting inside his. She looked happy, and for a father, sometimes that's enough reason to swallow an insult. I've swallowed worse. When I was 24, I went through a stretch where work dried up, and I spent several nights sleeping in the cab of my truck because I was too stubborn to admit to my father that I needed help. I've been broke. I've been exhausted. I've worked around men who could insult you before breakfast and forget your name by lunch. You learn something from years like that. Pride is expensive. Sometimes you put it away because somebody you love matters more. So I smiled. I ate my dinner, and I let Julian's parents believe whatever they wanted to believe about me. What I didn't expect was that they would eventually forget I was sitting there at all, because there was one thing nobody at that table knew. Not Jean-Luc, not Beatrice, not Julian, and, truthfully, not even Molly. Before I ever started my own contracting company, I spent several years in my 20s working overseas. Construction, industrial projects, infrastructure jobs. Most of that time was in southern France. Lyon, Marseille, a few smaller places between the two. I didn't learn French in a classroom. I learned it on job sites. I learned it from foremen yelling instructions while machinery was running. I learned it from lunch tables, arguments, jokes, invoices, bars, hardware suppliers, landlords, and men who stopped repeating themselves after the second week because they expected you to keep up. By the time I came home, I could speak French comfortably. Then I stopped using it. There wasn't much demand for fluent French on residential construction sites in Loudoun County. Years went by. It became one of those pieces of your life that simply goes into storage. Until that dinner. About halfway through the meal, Jean-Luc leaned toward his wife. His voice dropped. Then he said something in French. Beatrice answered, immediately. Sami language. Same low volume. A tiny laugh followed, and that was the moment I understood exactly what they thought of me. They didn't think I was listening. More than that, they didn't think I was capable of listening. To them, I had become part of the furniture, so I kept cutting my food, and I listened. At first, it was petty. Beatrice commented on Molly's dress. Pretty enough for something bought off the rack. Jean-Luc quietly repeated the way I'd mispronounced charcuterie earlier in the evening. He exaggerated my American accent. Beatrice covered her mouth with her napkin while she laughed. I kept eating. Small cruelty is still cruelty. But sometimes you let small things go. Then Beatrice looked toward a wall beside the host stand. The restaurant displayed photographs of work made by local craftsmen. Furniture, cabinetry, woodwork. One photograph showed a tall oak bookshelf. I recognized it immediately. I'd built it. Molly was 11 when I made that bookshelf for her bedroom. The wood came from an old barn that had stood on our property years before. Reclaimed oak. Heavy stuff. Hard on tools. I spent months working on it between jobs. Every shelf was fitted by hand. Every edge sanded until Molly could run her fingers across it without catching a splinter. For years, she kept her riding ribbons on the top shelf. Blue, red, yellow. Little pieces of her childhood lined up against wood I'd shaped myself. Beatrice studied the photograph for a few seconds. Then she said quietly, in French, "He probably pulled that wood out of a trash pile." Jean-Luc smiled. She continued, "Americans think putting a few boards together makes them craftsmen." Me fork stopped. I didn't slam it down. I didn't make a scene. I simply placed it beside the plate. Slowly, carefully. If you had known me well, you would have understood that something had just changed. She wasn't mocking some stranger's furniture. She was mocking 4 months of my life. She was mocking a piece of my daughter's childhood. And she was doing it 6 feet away from the man who built it. Nobody noticed. Julian was pouring himself more water. Molly glanced down at her phone and smiled at a message. Beatrice took another sip of wine, completely satisfied with herself. She thought she'd made a joke in a locked room, except the room wasn't locked. I looked up. Jean-Luc happened to meet my eyes. For half a second, there was something searching in his expression. A tiny question. Did he understand? I smiled. Warm. Relaxed. Nothing to worry about. Then I adjusted my napkin and spoke in English. "You know something I've always believed?" Jean-Luc looked at me. "What's that?" "The things a person makes with his own hands usually tell you more about him than the things he buys." I glanced toward the photograph on the wall. "Wouldn't you agree?" Jean-Luc hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. "Of course." "Good." I took another drink. I'd hate to think anyone here couldn't recognize the difference between something cheaply made and something built to last. Silence. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But 2 seconds can feel very long when you're wondering whether someone knows your secret. Then I smiled again. They relaxed. They had no idea, and I wasn't going to tell them. Not yet. I thought the insults were the worst part of the evening. I was wrong. Roughly 20 minutes later, dessert was gone and coffee had arrived. That was when Beatrice leaned toward Julian. Not toward her husband, toward her son. She spoke quietly in French. "Are the documents almost ready?" Julian barely looked away from his espresso. "Probably next week." My hand remained around my coffee cup. My expression didn't move. "Documents? What documents?" Beatrice asked another question. I caught only part of it. Something about a trust. Something about timing. Jean-Luc joined the conversation, and then he said a sentence that made every insult from earlier suddenly feel childish. The father wants their approval so badly. He gave a small laugh. "It's embarrassing." I didn't move. Then Julian laughed too. Julian, the man who had stood in front of me 4 months earlier, asking permission to marry Molly. The man whose eyes had gone wet while telling me how much he loved her. At least I'd believed they had. He leaned toward his parents and answered in French. "That's why this works." Then he took a sip of espresso. "He wants Molly happy more than anything." Another small smile. "He'll sign whatever we put in front of him." My stomach went cold. Julian continued. "I told you." A pause. "He's predictable." Then, almost instantly, his entire expression changed. He turned toward Molly, switched back to English, reached across the table and took her hand. "You having a good time, babe?" His voice was warm, gentle, perfect. Molly smiled. The best. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. And that was when I finally saw it. Julian wasn't simply marrying my daughter. He was performing the role of a man marrying my daughter. And I'd just watched him step backstage. I stared into my coffee as it cooled. The same hand holding Molly's fingers had belonged to the man who, seconds earlier, called her father predictable. Worse than that, whatever these documents were, Molly appeared to be connected to them, maybe even central to them. I didn't understand the whole plan yet, but I understood enough to know there was a plan. Every instinct in me wanted to stand up. I wanted to look Julian in the eye and ask him, in perfect French, exactly what he thought I was going to sign. I wanted to watch the expression disappear from his face. I wanted to ask Jean-Luc what kind of man crossed an ocean to insult his host while planning something behind his daughter's back. But anger is loud, and sometimes loud is exactly what the other person needs from you. So I stayed seated, because if I exploded right there, Molly wouldn't hear what I'd heard. She would only see her father ruining her engagement dinner. And Julian would have plenty of time to invent an explanation. So I kept my hands around the coffee cup. I kept my face calm. And somewhere underneath all that calm, one thought settled into place. Not yet. Every instinct in my body told me to stand up, to push my chair back, to look Julian straight in the face and ask him, in French, exactly what documents he thought I was going to sign. I could already imagine it. The silence, the color, leaving Jean-Luc's face. Beatrice realizing that every private joke she'd made all evening hadn't been private at all. It would have felt good, for about 30 seconds. Then I stopped myself. Not here, not tonight. Because fatherhood teaches you something pride usually doesn't. Being right isn't enough. You have to know when being right will actually matter. If I exploded in the middle of that restaurant over a conversation Molly hadn't understood, what would she see? She wouldn't see 3 people discussing something behind her back. She'd see her father suddenly losing his temper at the dinner she'd been hoping would bring everyone together. Julian would play confused. His parents would look offended, and Molly would probably defend him. Maybe she'd even apologize for me. That thought bothered me more than anything I'd heard in French, because if I reacted too soon, I wouldn't expose Julian. I'd help him. I'd give him the perfect story. The possessive father, the suspicious contractor, the man who couldn't accept that his daughter was building a life with somebody else. No, I wasn't going to hand them that weapon. So I smiled. I finished my coffee. I paid the bill. And yes, I left a generous tip. Then I walked everybody outside, as though the evening had gone exactly the way I'd hoped. At the valet stand, I shook Jean-Luc's hand. Wonderful evening. He smiled. Indeed. I turned to Beatrice. I'm glad you enjoyed yourselves. Oh, very much. I did too. That was probably the most truthful thing I'd said all night. Just not for the reason she imagined. They climbed into their car, believing the dumb American contractor had swallowed every insult and missed every secret. I watched the taillights disappear. Then I got into my truck. It was an old pickup I'd owned since Molly was little. The driver's seat had a tear near the edge. The dashboard rattled on rough roads. There were scratches along the bed from lumber, stone, tools, and about 20 years of actual work. I sat there without starting it. For a long time. They think I'm stupid. That was the first thought. The second one was worse. They think they've already won. I saw the bookshelf again in my head. The oak, the dust, those evenings, sanding edges after Molly had gone to sleep. 4 months of work reduced to a joke, because Beatrice couldn't imagine that craftsmanship existed outside the world she respected. Then I heard Jean-Luc's voice. Predictable. And Julian's. He'll sign anything. Suddenly, the insults didn't matter. The paperwork did. Whatever these people were planning, they were counting on 2 things. That I loved my daughter, and that loving her made me easy to control. I wrapped both hands around the steering wheel. All right. I said it aloud even though nobody could hear me. You think you know me. The engine turned over. But before I tell you how wrong you are, I'm going to find out exactly what you're doing. That became my promise. No confrontation, no accusation, no warning. Not yet. I wanted the whole picture, and when I finally had it, I wanted them to explain themselves with nowhere left to hide, preferably in the language they thought belonged only to them. I drove home slower than usual. On nights when my mind gets crowded, I don't trust myself with yellow lights. Molly texted before I reached the house. "Dad, thank you for tonight." A second message followed. "I know you were really trying with them. It means a lot to me." I sat in the driveway reading those words. Once. Then again, she thought I had spent the evening trying to win their approval. That was almost funny. Almost. The truth was going to hurt her. I knew that. But there are different kinds of hurt. There's the pain of finding out somebody lied to you before you marry them. And then there's the pain of finding out 10 years later, after your finances, your home, your children, and your entire future are tied to the lie. I'd choose the first one for my daughter every time. I typed back, "Anything for you, sweetheart." Then another line, "Get some sleep." I waited until the message showed delivered. Then I made a phone call. Grant Ferris and I hadn't spoken regularly in years. We'd known each other back when I was working overseas. Grant had eventually left construction and moved into corporate risk consulting. That title sounded boring until you understood what he actually did. He found things people hoped nobody would find. Companies, assets, dispute, business relationships, records buried under other records. And, more importantly, he still knew people all over Europe. It was late, close to midnight. He answered after a few rings. "Mark Withers." His voice carried immediate suspicion. "Either you've suddenly become nostalgic, or something's wrong." "Something's wrong." The humor disappeared. "What do you need?" "I need you to look into a family in France." There was a pause. "Business? Maybe. Legal? I don't know yet." "That's comforting. I've got names. Send them." "And Grant?" "Yeah? I need you to be thorough." Another pause. Then his voice changed. Professional now. "How thorough?" "Thorough enough that if somebody's trying to put their hands on my daughter's future, I know about it before they do." Grant didn't ask another unnecessary question. "Send me everything." I hung up. That was the moment the game changed. Jean-Luc, Beatrice, and Julien thought the difficult part was over. They believed they'd met the father. They'd smiled. They'd tolerated the American food. They'd survived dinner. Now, all that remained was paperwork. What they didn't understand was that the paperwork had just become the most dangerous part of their plan. For the next few weeks, I gave them exactly the version of Mark Withers they wanted. Friendly, unsophisticated, grateful, a little intimidated by their sophistication. The kind of future father-in-law who wanted acceptance badly enough to overlook details. It was a role, and apparently I'd been preparing for it my entire life. The next morning, before I even made coffee, I called Molly. "Morning, sweetheart." "Hey, Dad. You busy?" "Not really. I was thinking about Jean-Luc and Beatrice." That got her attention. "Oh? Why don't they stay in the guest house?" Silence. "For the rest of their visit?" "Sure." "Dad." "What? Are you serious?" "Why wouldn't I be?" She hesitated. "I just know dinner was a lot." I almost laughed. "It was more than you know." Instead, I said, "I want this to work, Molly." And that part was completely true. I wanted whatever came next to work. I simply had a very different definition of success now. They're going to be family if everything goes the way you're planning. I continued. They shouldn't have to drive back and forth from a hotel in D.C. every day. "Dad, that's incredibly nice. The guest house is sitting there empty." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Her voice softened. "Thank you. Don't make a big thing out of it. It means a lot." After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window. The guest house sat across the yard. I had built that too. Same general period of my life when I built Molly's bookshelf. Back when she was small enough to follow me around the property carrying a coffee can full of nails and insisting she was my assistant. I stared at the place for a while. "You want to study my life? Fine. Come closer." You want to think you're smarter than the man who built everything you're looking at? Even better, move right in. Just remember something. Walls aren't as private as people think, especially when the man who owns them understands the language you're whispering in. Jean-Luc and Beatrice moved into the guest house later that week. Julian stayed with Molly in town. That actually made things easier. Managing 2 performances under my roof was enough. For nearly a week, I played the welcoming host. I asked Beatrice about Normandy. She told me about gardens, old stone houses, local markets, and neighbors whose family names apparently mattered more than most people's resumes. I listened, like I was fascinated. Jean-Luc joined me outside one afternoon while I was cooking. Smoke rolled from the old smoker behind the house. Pork had been sitting in it for hours. Jean-Luc watched me check the temperature. "You know," he said, holding a glass of wine, "with a proper marinade, you could improve this considerably." I looked at the smoker, then at him. "That right?" "Oh, absolutely." I nodded thoughtfully. "I'll have to try that sometime." He smiled, satisfied. I smiled too, but I wasn't listening for cooking advice. I was listening for names, dates, business references, anything that connected one conversation to another. They thought I was being polite. I was taking inventory. Every careless remark mattered now. Every phone call they took outside. Every reference to France. Every comment about lawyers, property, planning, accounts. They wanted to underestimate me? Fine. That was the best advantage they'd given me all month. A few nights later, Jean-Luc and Beatrice went to bed early. Jet lag, they said. Maybe. I waited until the lights in the guest house went dark. Then I took my phone outside and sat in the truck. Grant answered immediately. "Talk to me." I didn't bother with hello. "What did you find?" His response came without the usual jokes. "I've been doing this a long time, Mark." I waited. "And?" "This family has problems." My grip tightened around the phone. "Start with Jean-Luc. The import company he talks about?" "Yeah. It's barely alive." I stared toward the guest house. Grant continued. "The company went through restructuring about 2 years ago." "Bad?" "Worse than they're presenting." "How much worse?" "There are outstanding obligations tied to the business." He paused. "And there are tax claims connected to family property in Normandy." "For how long?" "A few years." I leaned back against the seat. "So they're broke?" I wouldn't simplify it that far. Grant was always careful with words. "But they're under serious financial pressure." "Pressure they haven't mentioned." "No." "Anything else?" "Plenty." I looked toward the dark windows across the yard. "What about Julian?" Grant exhaled. "I knew that sound. He's involved in an active civil dispute in France." "For what?" "Failed business venture." "What kind?" "Import-export operation." "How bad?" "Investors lost money." "Criminal?" "Nothing I found suggests that." That distinction mattered. Grant continued. "But don't confuse not criminal with not serious." I didn't. "Does Molly know?" "You tell me." "No." "Then that's a problem." I stared at the steering wheel. Julian had talked about his career, his family, his ambitions, his future with Molly. He had somehow never found time to mention a collapsed business venture and active litigation. Grant wasn't finished. "You said you overheard them discussing a trust?" "Yes." "What exactly?" "Something about papers being prepared." "Before the wedding?" "That's what it sounded like." "And they're presenting it as family planning?" "I haven't seen anything yet." Grant went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If they put something in front of you, don't sign it." I wasn't planning to. "I'm serious." "So am I." "What do they want from you?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Grant asked me several questions about my assets. Property, business holdings, commercial land. When I mentioned the acreage I own near one of the major roads, he stopped me. "Have they asked about that?" "Jean-Luc has." "More than once?" I thought about it. "Yeah." Grant exhaled again. "Mark, if somebody with financial pressure overseas starts talking about combining family assets through a trust, especially anything with an offshore component, pay attention." "Meaning?" "Your land has value. I know that. Not just sale value. He slowed down. Collateral value. That word sat differently. Collateral. Grant continued. If they can structure a trust where your property supports obligations elsewhere, that property can become leverage. For their company. Potentially. You think that's what they're doing? I think you need the actual documents before I tell you anything stronger than that. Fair. Grant never gave me a conclusion when all he had was suspicion. That's why I'd called him. But the shape of the thing was starting to appear. Jean-Luc's struggling company. The tax problems. Julian's failed venture. The secret conversations. The trust. My property. And their confidence that I would sign whatever made Molly happy. After we hung up, I stayed in the dark. They hadn't crossed an ocean simply because their son was getting married. Maybe family mattered to them. Maybe parts of their affection were real. But money was in the room too. And suddenly I couldn't ignore it. I remembered Molly smiling across the dinner table. She thought I was being evaluated. Was Mark respectable enough? Was his house impressive enough? Was his wine good enough? Was his occupation sophisticated enough for them? Now I wondered if the evaluation had been about something else entirely. Not whether I was worthy of joining their family, whether my assets were useful to it. I slept badly that night. A few days later, the opening I had been waiting for arrived. Sunday brunch. I invited Jean-Luc and Beatrice to eat on the back porch. Ham, biscuit, fresh coffee. Nothing complicated. Jean-Luc sat across from me, looking unusually pleased with himself. Halfway through the meal, he put his cup down. Mark, Julian mentioned that you own commercial property nearby. There it was. I looked mildly surprised. A little. He described it as substantial. Depends what you call substantial. Jean-Luc smiled. In Europe, families often take a more unified approach to property. I leaned back. How so? We consolidate. He folded his hands. Think generationally. Beatrice nodded beside him. It protects everyone. Sounds sensible. Jean-Luc continued. Our estate attorneys are preparing a family trust. I gave him exactly the expression he expected. Interested. Slightly confused. A trust? For Molly and Julian. He smiled. For their future. Beatrice leaned toward me. Family, protecting family. There was warmth in her voice. If I hadn't heard her at dinner, I might even have believed it. Jean-Luc continued. We'd like you to review the draft before the wedding. Me? Naturally. I scratched my chin. Let him see the contractor thinking hard. Let him see a man uncomfortable with financial language. I'll be honest with you. I gave a small laugh. I understand. Lumber. Jean-Luc smiled. Of course. Concrete. Another smile. Certainly. Contracts for houses? I shrugged. But trusts? Beatrice gave me that patient expression again. You don't need to worry about the complexity. Exactly. That was the sentence I had been waiting for. I looked at Jean-Luc. Why don't you have your attorneys send me everything? His eyes changed. Barely. Afflicker. Triumph. Then it disappeared behind charm. Of course. I'll read it. Excellent. And if I don't understand it, I'll ask questions. Naturally. He lifted his coffee. I knew what he thought. The fish had taken the bait. What Jean-Luc didn't understand was that I wasn't the fish. I was the man waiting to see what kind of hook he'd brought. The documents arrived shortly afterward. That night I carried the folder into my study, closed the door, and spread everything across the desk. Then I started reading. Page 1, page 2, page 3, and for the first time since this whole thing began, I had to admit something I didn't enjoy admitting. I didn't understand half of it. The irony almost made me laugh. I could understand every insult Jean-Luc whispered in French. I could read blueprints upside down. I could look at a foundation and tell you where somebody cut corners. But this? Trust, structures, beneficial interests, asset transfers, offshore entities, cross-references pointing to clauses buried 10 pages later. The words were English. They might as well have been another language. I sat back in my chair and stared at the folder. For years, I'd built my life around knowing how to solve problems myself. Measure twice. Cute once. If something breaks, Figure out why. If something leaks, find the source. If something isn't square, fix it before the next piece goes on. But this wasn't lumber, and pride wasn't going to protect Molly. So I reached for my phone. I stared at the papers for another minute. Then I picked up the phone. There are moments when pride becomes nothing more than a bad habit. I'd spent most of my adult life solving my own problems. Contracts, land disputes, bad subcontractors, permit fights, customers who suddenly forgot what they'd agreed to once the invoice arrived. You learn to trust yourself when you've been in business long enough. Maybe too much. Asking for help can feel like admitting somebody else is smarter than you. That night, I didn't care, because this wasn't about me. It was about Molly. And if there was even a chance she might sign something like this one day, believing it was part of some beautiful family arrangement, I wasn't going to let my ego stand between her and the truth. It was a little after 10 when I called Roger Callahan. Roger had been my attorney for years. Land purchases, commercial leases, contract disputes. Anything complicated enough to make me stop pretending I understood legal language. He answered on the 4th ring. "Mark, sorry about the hour." He laughed once. Mark Withers calling me after 10 at night. I heard a chair scrape on his end. That's never followed by good news. "I need you to look at something." "What kind of something?" "A trust." That got his attention. "For you?" "Supposedly for Molly." "Supposedly? That's why I'm calling." I picked up the first page. "I don't understand half of this. Read me the section that's bothering you." I did. Slowly. A paragraph about irrevocable interests. Another about beneficial transfers. Then language involving collateral obligations and an offshore entity. Roger didn't interrupt me. That worried me. Normally, Roger interrupted everybody. When I finished, there was silence. "Roger, I'm here." "What?" Another pause. "Send me the whole document. Tell me what you heard first." "Mark," his voice had gone flat. That particular voice usually meant somebody had either made a very expensive mistake or was about to. "This is not a simple family trust. I figured that much. It's definitely not a wedding gift." "What is it?" He took a breath. "From what you're reading, it looks like a cross-collateralization structure." "English, Roger. I'm speaking English. Contractor English." That got half a laugh out of him. Then he got serious again. "Think of it this way. Okay, you own valuable commercial property." "Right. They're trying to structure the trust so that property can support debt connected to another entity. Jean-Luc's company. If that's the entity named in the document, yes." My grip tightened around the phone. "So my land backs his debt. Potentially more directly than that." "How directly?" "If the structure works the way I think it does and that company defaults, lenders could make claims against the assets tied into the trust." I looked down at the pages. "My land. Your land." The room suddenly felt smaller. I had spent decades building that life. Every job I took when I was too tired. Every cheap apartment. Every truck payment stretched 1 week too far. Every Saturday I worked instead of doing something easier. It was all sitting there in legal language, designed to make it look polite. Roger continued. "Mark, you're not transferring money into something for Molly." His voice slowed. "You may be offering up your property as support for somebody else's liabilities." I leaned back in the chair. There it was. The thing I'd been circling around for days. Not suspicion anymore. Shape. Purpose. Grant found Jean-Luc's company is in trouble. How much trouble? Restructuring. Debts. Tax issues. And you're telling me they're asking you to put your property inside something connected to that company? That's what it looks like. Roger swore quietly. That was rare. "Send me everything." "I will. Tonight. You'll have it in 10 minutes. Anything Grant found, too. All of it." "And Mark?" "Yeah? Do not sign anything." I looked at the folder. Wasn't planning to. I ended the call. Then I sat there. No television. No music. Nothing but the soft hum of the air conditioner and those papers spread across the desk. I wasn't angry anymore. Not the way I'd been at the restaurant. That anger had been hot. Personal. The kind that makes your hands tighten around a fork because somebody insulted something you built for your daughter. This was different. Cold. Useful. They weren't trying to become part of my family. They were trying to turn my family into an asset. Molly's wedding wasn't the destination. It was the opening. I thought about Jean-Luc calling me desperate for approval. I thought about Julian saying I'd sign anything. I thought about every little laugh they had shared in French, because they believed language was a locked door and I was standing on the wrong side of it. They hadn't outsmarted me. They'd mistaken patience for stupidity. That was their real mistake. And now, I had Roger. I had Grant. And more importantly, I had time. The next morning, I found Jean-Luc sitting on the back porch with coffee. Same chair. Same view. He was looking over the property again. He did that a lot. At first, I'd taken it for admiration. Now it looked more like appraisal. I carried my mug outside. Morning. He turned. Mark. I sat across from him. I read those papers. His eyes sharpened immediately. Most of them anyway. He smiled. I know the language can be complicated. There was that tone again. Patient. Supérieur. Perfect. I gave him a tired smile. Complicated is one word for it. He leaned forward. But you understand the purpose. Oh, sure. I nodded. It's about Molly. His shoulders relaxed. Exactly. And family. Exactly. I scratched the side of my head. Honestly, Jean-Luc, I think it's a generous idea. His face brightened. Not much, but enough. I am very glad you see it that way. I just want to make sure we do it right. Naturally. I've got a family attorney. That flicker came back. Tiny. Concern. Then gone. I kept going before he could object. He knows my properties better than anybody. Of course. So why don't I have him clean everything up? Jean-Luc watched me. What do you mean by clean it up? Make it simpler. I laughed. For people like me. His expression softened again. Good. He can put it into one master agreement. I continued. Something everybody can understand. Jean-Luc nodded cautiously. And then, we sign it together. His eyes stayed on mine. Together, all of us. I leaned back. At the rehearsal dinner, for the first time since I'd walked outside, he looked genuinely surprised. I kept smiling. Whole family there. Everybody sees it. No confusion. Feels meaningful. The surprise disappeared. In its place came something much more dangerous. Delight. Mark. He smiled broadly. That is an excellent idea. I nearly admired him for how quickly he recovered. Good. A public family signing. He nodded. Very symbolic. That's what I was thinking. Symbolique. Absolutely. Just not in the way he imagined. Beatrice stepped onto the porch a moment later. Jean-Luc immediately told her. Her hands came together. Oh, Mark. She looked almost touched. This means so much to us. I smiled back. It means a lot to me, too. That might have been the most honest thing I'd said to either of them. They believed they'd won. I could see it. People are rarely better actors after victory. They relax. Their eyes change. Jean-Luc looked out over the property again. Only now I could practically see numbers moving behind his eyes. A criage. Value. Debt. Time. Just a few more days. That was what he thought. A few signatures. A family toast. Then all those problems back in France get breathing room. Let him think it. Let Beatrice pour herself another glass of my wine that evening. Let them toast privately in the guest house. They deserved one last celebration. After all, it was going to be the last thing they celebrated at my expense. The week before the rehearsal dinner passed strangely. Fast and slow at the same time. Slow because waiting always stretches time. Fast because once you know exactly when something is going to happen, every day feels like a number disappearing from a countdown. Roger and I worked almost every evening. He took the original trust apart clause by clause. Grant sans documentation from France. Company records. Financial filings. Information about the civil dispute involving Julian. Tax claims. Translations. Dates. Names. Everything checked twice. Then again, I didn't want drama. I wanted certainty. If I was going to destroy my daughter's engagement in front of 40 people, I was not going to do it because of a hunch. I wanted facts nobody at that table could talk around. Meanwhile, life outside my study continued as if nothing was wrong. Jean-Luc still sat at my table. Beatrice still offered unsolicited advice about food, furniture, flowers, and apparently civilization itself. Julian still came over smiling. "Hey, Pop." I hated that word now, but I smiled every time. Julian. He'd clap me on the shoulder like we were already family. Like he hadn't sat across from me weeks earlier and explained to his parents that my love for Molly made me predictable. Keep smiling. Every day you smile is one less day you suspect what's coming. Molly was the hardest part. She was happier than I'd seen her in years. Wedding plans had consumed her entire life. Seating charts, music, flowers, dinner choices, photographers, dress fittings. At one point, she texted me 2 pictures. One showed white roses. The other was a loose arrangement of wildflowers. "Dad, which one?" I stared at the screen. She had no idea what I was doing. No idea that while she was picking flowers, I was sitting with a lawyer planning how to show her that the man she intended to marry had lied to her. I zoomed in on the wildflowers. Black-eyed Susans. Queen Anne's lace. Nothing too polished. Nothing trying too hard. "Wildflowers," I typed. Her reply came almost immediately. "Really? Always." I looked at that word for a long time, because in a few days, Molly was going to lose the future she'd been imagining. And if I did this right, maybe she'd get something more important back. Choice. Her own life. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for Saturday. We hosted it at my place. String lights went up between the old trees in the backyard. Longue table. White linens. Wildflower centerpieces in glass jars. Good china we barely used. A small band setting up near the edge of the patio. About 40 people in all. Family. Friends. People Molly had known since college. People I'd known for decades. The kind of gathering where everybody assumes the biggest danger is somebody drinking too much champagne before dinner. Jean-Luc and Beatrice looked completely at home. Naturally, they stood near the head table holding champagne glasses, smiling like visiting royalty. My champagne. I'd bought an entire case for the evening. Beatrice wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than the truck I'd owned when Molly was born. Jean-Luc wore a jacket that fit him like he'd been measured inside it. Same calm smile. Same pleasant superiority. He looked across my yard like a man already remembering it as his. "Enjoy the view," I thought. "You've got about 2 hours left." Near the drinks table, I saw Beatrice lean toward Julian. She glanced in my direction. Her mouth moved. The band was warming up. People were talking everywhere. I couldn't hear every word. This time, I didn't need to. I caught enough French to understand the meaning. "Look at him." Then she laughed softly. Julian looked toward me, smirked into his glass. Maybe he said something clever back. Maybe he didn't. It no longer mattered. I knew the tone. I'd heard it the first night. Duck. Wine. Bookshelf. Contractor. Predictable. It had all led here. Roger arrived shortly after. Blazer. Open collar. Club soda. He looked exactly like what I needed him to look like. An old family friend. Nobody watching him would have guessed there was a folder locked in his car, containing enough documentation to turn the entire evening inside out. He caught my eye from across the patio. A small nod. Nothing more. Ready. I looked for Molly. She was near the dessert table laughing with 2 college friends. The lights above us caught the edge of her dress. She looked happy. Completely happy. That almost stopped me. Almost. I watched her for several seconds. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." I didn't say it aloud, but I felt every word. "I'm going to hurt you tonight. There's no clean way around that. But I'd rather break your heart once with the truth than watch him break it slowly with lies for the next 20 years. That was enough. I picked up my champagne glass, tapped the rim gently with my ring. Once. Twice. The sound traveled farther than I expected. Conversations began fading. One table first, then another. The band stopped. Eventually there was nothing but crickets in the trees and the faint electric buzz of one of the string lights over my shoulder. I stood. Can I steal everybody for a minute? Faces turned toward me. I promise I'll return you to dinner before the trout gets cold. A few people laughed. Good. I wanted them relaxed, especially 3 of them. I think most of you know I'm not much for speeches. More smiles. I'd rather be fixing a roof than standing in front of 40 people pretending I know how to make a toast. That got another laugh. Molly looked at me. Proud. Grateful. The same expression she'd worn after that first dinner. Thank you for trying so hard with them. I had tried, just not in the way she thought. I lifted the glass. My daughter is supposed to be getting married in 2 weeks. Julian smiled, still comfortable, still holding his champagne loosely, still playing the man with nothing to hide. I looked at Molly. I've spent her whole life trying to make sure of 2 things. The yard went quieter, that she never has to wonder whether she's loved. I paused, and that she never has to wonder whether the people closest to her are telling her the truth. My eyes moved briefly toward Julian. His smile remained, not for long. Then I turned toward Jean-Luc and Beatrice. And I want to thank our guests. I raised my glass toward them. For traveling all this way. Jean-Luc bowed his head slightly. The pleasure is ours, Mark. I'm sure it is. Beatrice's smile shifted. Barely, but I saw it. Maybe something in my voice. Maybe instinct. Maybe for the first time that evening, she realized I wasn't giving the speech she'd expected. Good, because I was finished giving them what they expected. That's not a small gesture. I let my eyes move from Jean-Luc to Beatrice. You crossed an ocean for people you barely knew. Jean-Luc gave me that polished little nod of his. The pleasure has been entirely ours, Mark. I'm sure it has. Something in the way I said it reached Beatrice before it reached him. Her smile didn't disappear. It just weakened. Only at the corners. The way a window rattles once before a storm arrives. I set my glass down. And since you've come all the way from Normandy, I thought it might be appropriate to finish this toast in a language that feels a little more familiar to you. Jean-Luc stopped moving. Beatrice stared at me. Julian's smile vanished. I continued calmly, especially since the 3 of you have spent the last few weeks believing I couldn't understand a word of it. Nobody laughed. Good. I turned directly toward Jean-Luc. Then I spoke French. The language came back easier than I'd expected. 25 years disappeared in a breath. The rhythm, the vowels, the old accent I'd buried under decades of Virginia construction sites. Jean-Luc's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Beatrice looked like someone had opened a trap door beneath her chair. I kept going. For weeks, you discussed my daughter as though she were an entry on a balance sheet. No one at the table understood every word. They didn't need to. They understood Jean-Luc's face. You mocked my profession. His eyes stayed fixed on me. You mocked my home. Beatrice's hands tightened around her glass. You insulted the things I built for my daughter. Then I looked at Julian. And you called Molly predictable while the 3 of you discussed how to use this marriage to reach my property. Julian pushed his chair back. Mark, I switched to English. Sit down. He froze. Mark, you don't understand. I answered him in French. I understood you perfectly at the restaurant. Then back to English. Every word. The silence hit the table harder than shouting ever could. People began looking from me to Jean-Luc. Then Beatrice. Then Julian. Finally, Molly. She was staring at me. Confused at first. Then worried. Then something changed. Dad? Her voice was small. I turned to her. That was the hardest part of the whole night. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Her face tightened. What are you talking about? I didn't want you to learn this in front of everybody. I paused. But I also wasn't going to let you learn it after you were married. Roger was already moving. He crossed the patio and handed me the folder. I placed it on the table. Jean-Luc recognized it immediately. Not the exact folder. The idea of it. Documents. Paper. The thing he thought was going to save him. Only this set had been assembled by people working for me. I opened it. A few weeks ago, Jean-Luc and Beatrice asked me to participate in what they described as a family trust. Jean-Luc leaned forward. Mark, I think perhaps— No, I didn't raise my voice. You've had weeks to talk. I turned one page. Tonight, you can listen. He sat back. I looked down the table. They presented it as estate planning. I looked at Molly, a way to protect you and Julian. Her eyes moved toward her fiancé. He wouldn't look at her. I continued. What the documents actually did was tie my commercial property to an offshore structure connected to Jean-Luc's business interests. The first murmur moved through the guests. I slid a copy onto the table. My attorney reviewed it. Roger stayed silent beside the drinks table. Grant reviewed the business records. Another page. Jean-Luc's company has been under serious financial pressure for years. Jean-Luc's face hardened. That is a gross simplification. Then simplify this. I tapped the document. Tax claims. Another page. Restructuring. Another. Outstanding obligations. Then I looked at him, and a proposed trust that places assets I spent 30 years building within reach of debt that isn't mine. Someone farther down the table whispered, "May God." Beatrice finally spoke. This was meant to protect the children. I turned to her. Which children? She stopped. Because from where I'm standing, the only thing this arrangement protected was your family's balance sheet. Julian stood halfway. That's not fair. I turned to him. Sit. Mark, I'm not finished. Something in my voice made him lower himself back into the chair. I pulled out another sheet. And Julian. Molly looked at him immediately. This part is yours. His face changed. You currently have an active civil dispute in France related to a failed business venture. Molly stared. What? Julian finally looked at her. Molly, I can explain. I kept going. Investors lost money. Dad. Nothing I've found says it's criminal. I looked at Molly, not Julian. I'm not going to call it something it isn't. Then I turned back to him. But it existed. His jaw tightened. And you never told the woman you're supposed to marry. Molly's voice came quietly. Is that true? Julian's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Julian. It's complicated. Molly blinked. That answer did more damage than anything I could have said. How long? He looked at the table. Molly, how long have you known? That's not the point. She stared at him. For the first time that evening, the hurt in her face disappeared. Something colder took its place. Then, what is the point? He reached toward her. She pulled her hand away. Molly, listen to me. No. Her voice was calm now, almost frighteningly calm. I have been listening to you for months. She glanced toward his parents. I listened when you told me how much family meant to you. Back to him. I listened when you told me you respected my father. Julian swallowed. I do. No. Molly shook her head. You laughed at him. His expression cracked. You sat with your parents and mocked his work. Molly, you mocked our home. She looked at Beatrice. You made jokes about my clothes. Beatrice went pale, and all three of you assumed none of it mattered because he couldn't understand you. Julian leaned forward. That has nothing to do with us. Molly laughed once. There was no humor in it. It has everything to do with us. She looked directly at him. You didn't just hide money problems from me. Her voice lowered. You made me part of them. Julian shook his head. No. Yes. She reached for her left hand. The movement was slow. Deliberate. Everyone saw it. She pulled off the ring. Julian went still. Molly. She placed it on his plate, right beside a piece of trout he hadn't touched. The small sound of metal against porcelain seemed louder than it should have. I was planning to spend my life with you. Julian's face collapsed. Molly, please. She stood, and you were planning to spend mine fixing yours. Nobody spoke. She pushed her chair back. For a moment, I thought she'd run. Nobody would have blamed her. Instead, she walked around the table, past her friends, past Roger, past 40 people, trying not to stare. She came to me, and she stood beside me. Not behind me, beside me, shoulder to shoulder. That mattered, more than she knew. I looked at Julian. His parents sat rigid on either side of him. Jean-Luc's face had lost all its polish. Beatrice looked smaller somehow. Not because anyone had humiliated her, because everything she'd said in private had simply come back into the room. I reached into the folder again. One more thing. Julian looked exhausted. I handed him another document. This isn't about the trust. He unfolded it. What is this? An accounting. He looked up. For what? For the expenses associated with your family's stay. Jean-Luc frowned. Mark. And attached to it is written notice that the guest house needs to be vacated by tomorrow. Beatrice stared at me. You are throwing us out. I'm asking you to leave my property. After everything, I looked at her. Careful. She stopped. Jean-Luc found his voice. Thin. Now. Surely this can be discussed privately. I almost smiled. We've been discussing things privately for weeks. His eyes narrowed. The only difference is that tonight, you know, I was part of the conversation. Nobody moved. I picked up my champagne glass again, took one slow sip, then set it down. And Jean-Luc, he looked at me. For what it's worth, I paid for tonight's dinner myself. His face tightened. Out of the contractor's bank account. A few people looked down, trying not to react. I tell you, you're welcome. I paused. But after listening to you for 3 weeks, I don't think gratitude is really your specialty. Beatrice looked toward the guest house. I followed her eyes. The windows glowed across the yard. A place I'd built years ago. Samahens. Same tools. Same life they'd dismissed as unsophisticated. The house is unlocked. I nodded toward it. You can stay there tonight if you need to. Then I added, personally, I'd call a hotel. Jean-Luc stared at me. Why? The breakfast will probably meet your standards. That earned a few nervous laughs. Nobody at their end of the table joined in. Jean-Luc looked like he wanted to argue. I watched him search for a way back into control. He couldn't find one. Not with the documents open. Not with Roger standing there. Not with Julian, unable to answer Molly. Not with their own conversations now sitting in the middle of the party. Some traps close because somebody pushes a button. Others close because people keep walking forward after they're certain nobody is watching. This was the second kind. I closed the folder. Then I looked at Molly. Her eyes were wet, but her back was straight. You ready? I asked it quietly. Only for her. She nodded. Yeah. We walked away together. Past the lights. Past the tables. Past the wildflowers she'd picked. Behind us were 40 stunned guests and 3 people whose confidence had disappeared in less than 10 minutes. Somewhere behind me, Beatrice called my name. Then Molly's. Maybe she was apologizing. Maybe she was explaining. Maybe she was angry. I didn't turn around. I'd spent weeks listening to that family. I didn't need another word. We crossed the yard toward the house. For years, I'd imagined walking my daughter down an aisle. That night, instead, I walked her away from one, and I was grateful for it. Molly reached for my hand. The gesture hit me harder than anything that had happened at the table. She used to do that when she was little. Back when she'd follow me around while I worked. Back when she'd carry nails in an old coffee can and tell everybody she was helping build the house. Her fingers closed around mine. Thank you, Dad. I looked at her. For what? She wiped at one eye. For hearing what I couldn't. I squeezed her hand. Always. Behind us, the string lights kept glowing. The champagne was still on the tables. The wildflowers were still standing in their jars. Everything looked exactly the way it had 20 minutes earlier. But nothing was the same. Jean-Luc and Beatrice had crossed an ocean believing they were coming to take something from my family. Instead, they left with nothing they had come for. No land, no marriage, no leverage. Just the echo of their own words. Words they had spoken freely because they thought the quiet man across the table couldn't understand them. That had been their biggest mistake. Not the trust, not the debt, not even Julian's lies. Their biggest mistake was believing that a man with rough hands and an old truck was too simple to recognize when someone was trying to use his daughter. I wasn't smarter than all of them. I wasn't richer. I wasn't more sophisticated. I just listened. And once I knew the truth, I didn't waste it. Molly and I reached the back door. She looked over her shoulder once. Then she faced forward again. So did I. Some people raise a glass to celebrate what they're about to gain. That night, I raised mine because I already knew exactly what they were about to lose.